If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Well, welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Cory. Say hi, Cory.
Oh, hello.
We are once again in the deep piney woods along the shores of the Great Lakes, and it's a fine summer evening, and we are following up on an episode we did recently about evolution. Mm-hmm. And we kept saying in that conversation, we should come back to unpack some of this a little bit more.
Well, it just leads off into so many other topics that are related.
Right. And the one that we want to kind of pick up on coming out of that last one is this notion that that Catholicism is opposed to science. Because I think that's where a little bit of this subtext came from in our conversation, where we were saying, well, like, hey, evolutionary biology says this, or the sciences say this and this, and Catholicism, is seen by many people as opposed to science.
It's a very popular misconception.
Right.
And a lot of people either leave the church or are not motivated to look at the church in the first place because they believe that.
Right. So what I wanted to do in this conversation is drill down on this issue of whether the Catholic Church is opposed to, or the enemy of, or an antagonist of, or whatever you want to say, of science. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because I think what we're going to say here, well, we'll see where this goes, but I don't think that it is if we understand the terms. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Right.
So let me kind of kick this off by kind of framing the conversation, and then I'll throw it to you, okay? So when people say Christianity in general is opposed to science, and Catholicism in particular, they'll say, is opposed to science, they have this notion that there are these sort of 2 competing worldviews, and that the Christian worldview or the religious worldview is opposed to this strictly rational science worldview. And on the one hand, I think that's true. And on the other hand, I think it's not true. And that's what I want to sort of explore, is the differentiation, or the ways in which it is and isn't true.
Right.
So to do that, I want to introduce a distinction. We can use the vocabulary in a lot of different ways, but let's start with this. Let's start with science. What is science? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to start with an understanding of science that, like, I learned in school. I don't know what they teach them in the schools these days, but what I learned in school, and I think pretty defensively, what science is, which is science is a way that the material world is observed empirically, meaning you go out and you look at it and you observe it, you measure it, right?
You make observations, you do experiments. Yeah.
Yeah. Observations, experiments, right? So you're looking at it in the raw, you're out there like, looking at stars or looking at plants or this, that, or you're conducting careful experiments, but you are empirically, it means through experientially observing, measuring, and then drawing or untestable conclusions, right? So science, what it does, it advances hypotheses. It says, I believe, like, okay, right behind you as you sit there is a white pine tree. Mm-hmm. And just off to my left, there is a red pine tree. And there you can tell the difference between a white pine and a red pine, because a white pine has 5 needles growing out of the cluster and a red pine has 2. Okay? Now that's an observation that you go out, you draw conclusions, you look at enough pine trees, you count needles, you look at their bark, right? And so a botanist over time classified these things and says a white pine is a particular kind of pine that has certain characteristics, including 5 needles. A red pine is a particular kind of pine that has 2 needles growing out of the cluster, right?
Right.
But at first it advances a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that all white pines have 5 needles, all red pines have 2 needles. And then people can go test that hypothesis. 1,000 other botanists can go out there and look at pine trees and walk through forests and count them. And the first guy publishes a paper which is peer-reviewed. And after a certain amount of time, people come to accept that observation, and it becomes an accepted classification, right?
Because the evidence supports it and it hasn't been disproven.
Right. That is science in its purest sense. It is observation of the empirical observation of the material world, processed through the scientific method, reviewed, hypotheses, theories, conclusions, right? Now, I don't believe that Catholicism or Christianity is opposed to science as I described it at all. That is the scientific method, and we'll get into this a little bit in this conversation, that the church has always supported. But there is another way that the word science is used. I'm going to say it's science with a capital S as opposed to science with a small s. If science with a small s is what I just described a moment ago, empirical observation and conclusions and experimentation and all that of the material world, science with a capital S is a worldview. Sometimes it's called scientism, but basically it is a worldview, almost a quasi-religious or philosophical worldview of scientific materialism. And it's the notion that only the material world exists. Nothing exists, either nothing exists beyond the material world or nothing beyond the material world is knowable. If it does exist, it's not knowable and it doesn't matter.
Well, and it privileges scientific knowledge, and the scientific method is really the only valid way of obtaining knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only valid way of obtaining it and the only knowledge that is valid. So in other words, if you have knowledge that's not derived from the scientific method and observation of the material world, that doesn't count as knowledge. And so this kind of scientific materialism, called scientism, science with a capital S, now that is directly opposed to Christianity and Catholicism, because the central claim of Christianity, Catholicism, and for that matter, of almost every other religion that I can think of, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever, is that there is a material world, a world of plants and dirt and stars and things that you can touch and feel and smell, right? But that there are things that exist beyond. There is an immaterial world. Sometimes if the first is called the natural world, the material was not, there is a supernatural that exists beyond it. And that's a central, fundamental claim, rationale, tenet of all the world's religions. So yes, religion in general, and Christianity and Catholicism in particular, is opposed to scientific materialism or the belief in science as the only or highest form or only valid form of knowledge, right?
Yes.
But it's not opposed to that science with a small s, which is the scientific method and observation and careful observation of the material world. Okay, I'll stop talking. Your turn.
Yeah, so I think it would be helpful to go back to something you alluded to there, talking about science and the sort of the history or the track record of the church with science. And what you see if you actually take an honest look at the history of thought and the history of science is that you have sort of abortive attempts at creating the scientific method and launching serious scientific knowledge in every religion and philosophy and culture and civilization until you get to medieval Christendom. You have kind of false starts. You of course have the Greeks, and there's some scientific inquiry going on there. You have some things going on in medieval Islamic society, but all of these kind of stall and come to a screeching halt for one reason or the other, because they don't have two essential philosophical premises that Christianity has in one form or another that makes it stop. And so Christianity, like some other religions, teaches that God created the universe and that he is separate from it. He is other than it. And this is not an original insight here. This has been noted many times before. But if you ascribe to some kind of animism or pantheism or those kinds of religious systems where God and the universe are very closely associated or even considered to be sort of two sides of the same coin, then eventually your scientific inquiry into the physical world is going to stall out, because you may appreciate God and you may worship God. You can go have a mystical experience in the mountains or in the forest or something if that's an aspect of God's essence, but you're not going to poke at it and investigate it and experiment on it. That's just something that's not going to go forward very far. And so Christianity teaches this, that the universe is other than God, that it's legitimate to experiment on and to investigate. And then following from that, it teaches that God is reasonable and rational and has created the universe in a way that's intelligible, that's consistent, that has laws, that we can plumb the depths of, that we can figure out how this all works, and that it's consistent. God is not capricious. It's not going to change. You have, especially in a lot of ancient pagan cultures, the sense that the world is chaotic and inconsistent and capricious, and we never know how things are going to go, and we can't understand it. But Christianity combines these two things, these two premises, in a way that allows, after these ideas have sort of sunken into the Christian culture, for scientific inquiry really to take off and grow and flourish in a way that it didn't anywhere else before that.
Yeah, well said. I would just add to that or expand on that, the notion that particularly came out of medieval, as you say, medieval Catholicism, that not only did God create an orderly universe, which therefore is knowable and therefore is subject to cataloging its laws. Mm-hmm. So, you can calculate the velocity of the wingspan of a European sparrow or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. You can calculate scientific laws and principles and these things, and they're consistent, right? I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, force equals mass times acceleration squared, mm-hmm. right? That doesn't change from one day to the next or from one circumstance to the next. It's always the same. And as you say, the pagans, not only did they believe that the universe was to some degree, as you said, capricious or fluid, they also believed that the gods were capricious. Mm-hmm. So Zeus could decide to turn into a swan because he wanted to rape the tree naiad or something stupid, right? Mm-hmm. But also in Islam, and we could get into this whole thing about sure. Islamic science, but also that Islam posits a God whose sovereignty makes the universe subject to his capricious will.
Right. It's voluntarism, that his will is above reason and can make a decision, can contradict itself. Allah
might want to have red pines with 5 needles or 6 needles or 18 needles. Inshallah, if God wills it, so it be. And so there is a sort of capriciousness, and what that did in especially the medieval universities, right, where mm-hmm. science, Western science was really born, was the notion that because we had a rational, knowable, orderly, consistent universe given to us by a good and reliable God or whatever, that then it was worth going out and observing and cataloging and calculating and making empirical observations and drawing hypotheses and conclusions because you can know it. Mm-hmm. So Catholicism in fact, has never been opposed to that. Christianity's never been opposed to that. But I want to come back to this scientific materialism, right? Which I do think is a fundamental contradiction. The notion that, right, the sort of scientism or belief that is so prevalent today that sort of worships scientific materialism, mm-hmm. right. which is what so many today are enamored of, because it really is a rejection of God. Someone's going to say, oh, you're not, but I really think that's what it is. I mean, and I don't believe
it's explicitly that.
Explicitly that is.
Nobody's arguing that.
Right. It basically says, I reject the notion of a supernatural. I reject the notion of a God. I reject the notion that there's any knowledge or there is anything, much less any knowledge about anything beyond what we can see, feel, measure, right? Mm-hmm. Observe. And this becomes super weird, right? So it becomes this kind of religious belief in the material world.
Well, and it becomes circular because we can't observe it. Why not? Because it doesn't exist.
Well, and in that, then scientists, particularly certain kinds of scientists, become sort of the priests of scientific materialism, right? Mm-hmm. Because there are no other people. These are the people that deliver truth to us. These are the people that mediate truth to us. These are the people that or the highest form of knowledge that we can have is knowledge of the material world. And so you began to see this. Now, one of the things that led to this, or threw gasoline on this fire, was, of course, Karl Marx, who, didn't come up with the idea, but bought completely into this materialist notion as sort of a scientific materialism, that mankind, through science, the social sciences and the physical sciences, was going to perfect the material world, including perfecting society.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is this struggle over and against the opiate of the masses, which is religion, which deceives people, to perfect the material world and life in the material world. And we have been living with that now for 150 years. And to the degree that Marxism has morphed into so many different contemporary ideologies, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has become the sort of primary opponent of Christianity and Catholicism in the contemporary world. Maybe another conversation we can talk about neo-paganism as a sort of whole other thing, right? But this is this sort of angry sort of assertion you get from people that get your God and all your mumbo jumbo and your sky fairy God and all your fake mumbo jumbo, and your church just wants to persecute scientists who just want to show us the material world and don't tell me anything else. So let's talk a little bit about that. Because one of the things that, first of all, obviously, I reject that because I am a theist. I am a Christian. As would all, Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and everybody else. We all reject it. And I particularly, as a Christian and as a Catholic, reject it. Right? Because they have a lot of rules. Right? Go talk to one of those people. They have all kinds of moral laws and rules, which is a little weird, because if all we can do is essentially go around and observe the differences between pine trees and draw conclusions about the empirical world, then you know what I'm saying? These people are chock full of moral, ethical, philosophical edicts.
Well, they end up just being assertions or presuppositions. And there's one at the very heart of that, the idea that if materialism is true and there's nothing outside of the observable world, and I'm just a collection of atoms called Cory and you're just a collection of atoms called Greg, then it shouldn't really matter whether I know that or not, or whether I tell people that or not, or whether I say something else, whether I preach Christianity or Islam or the flying spaghetti monster or whatnot. Like, there wouldn't be any way of judging whether that's right or wrong or not. It might be true or false or not, but to assign a moral value to that truth or falsity is another step that isn't warranted by the mere assertion of materialism.
Let me pick an example that let me pick I don't want to say it's controversial, but okay. Let's suppose I'm talking to my friend who is a scientific materialist, right? Mm-hmm. Believes just science. Science, escape your religion and all of your philosophical Christian mumbo jumbo and all of your sky fairies and all of that stuff. I just believe in science. Science, I tell you, right? Is all I believe in. I go, cool. I'm going to drown I'm going to, right? I'm going to go catch dolphins and drift nets. I'm going to, right?
Throw your plastic straws into the sea.
I'm going to throw my plastic straws into the sea to, I'm going to, poison pigeons in the park, right? Well, you can't do that. You can't do that to animals because we have to be.
To be fair, I'm not in favor of any of those things.
Right. But they'll start asserting animal rights to me and ethics about animals. Now, to be perfectly clear, I believe in animal ethics. I am a great animal lover and I believe in animal ethics, but that comes from my Christianity, right? That becomes from my Catholicism because I believe they're God's creatures, right? But if all you have is the scientific method, and I go around and I classify bottlenose dolphins from whatever the other kind are, non-bottlenose dolphins, right? And all I do is just, sort of make observations about the material world and draw scientific conclusions out of them. Well, who are you to tell me what ethics are? Right? Who are you to tell me that I shouldn't, eat a steak every night and and I shouldn't, butcher animals, right? I'm picking obviously an extreme example because what you have in that world a lot of times is a lot of very clear, strident moral laws, but those moral laws aren't based on anything, or well, they are. They're based on their intuitive senses, and they're this right. But you can't get from the scientific method, science with a small s. Mm-hmm. You especially can't get from scientific materialism to these ethics about animals or 10,000 other things that.
Yeah. No, ironically, I think it's quite often based on a very non-material source, which is an intuition or an observation of beauty or goodness. And you can't scientifically assert what is beautiful and what isn't. Beauty is not it's a physical phenomenon in the sense that physical things that I can see are beautiful, but you can't experimentally verify what's beautiful or not. That brings us into philosophy, which is a non-scientific realm of knowledge.
I think you're onto something there, because I think what happens is the materialist, it's such a starved and sort of poor existence to be a materialist, and it's unsustainable, it's unlivable, mm-hmm. because A, it isn't true. And so the materialist can sit there and say, I refuse to believe that there's anything beyond what I observe, but I'm constantly haunted by these senses, moral senses of ethics, senses of moral law, sense of these which are built into us that you can't explain or have no rational basis if there is nothing but the material universe, right? Pick it. I mean, I'm obviously using the animal thing, but you could talk about murder, you could talk about this, you could talk about anything else. What's weird is if you follow the scientific materialist road to its logical conclusion, that's where we end up with genocides. Okay, that's where you end up with following Marxism to its rational conclusion in Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, the killing fields, right? Because at the end of the day, then people are there is nothing beyond the material universe. There is no ethic beyond it. Survive at most, you might argue some utilitarian notion of survival of the species, and if that means eliminating these people or killing these people or doing this or that, well, whatever you do, whatever, right?
But even that becomes unsustainable because you can't experimentally or observationally verify that our species is particularly worthy of survival.
Right. And so really the scientific materialist, really it is an unsustainable place. And then they're constantly drawing on some kind of ethics, but their ethics are not examined and they're not rooted in anything. I mean, I look around at these trees, I look around at the animals and I say, well, this is my Father's world. And right. And he shines in all that's fair, the rocks and trees, mm-hmm. Blah, blah, blah. Right. I mean, I look at all of this and I think of St. Francis of Assisi and, right. And I think about a God who created this and made me a steward of it. And I have an accountability to God. I also think, like you say, of truth, goodness, and beauty. I look at the animal, I look at his beauty, I look at the tree and I look at its beauty. I see these things and I realize that those, per Francis of Assisi, right, that these things come from God. They are reflections mm-hmm. of him. It is, praise God because he has made these beautiful things that draw me back to the Creator. So what I'd say is that, the Catholic notion of these ethics is rooted in, we can talk about those things, are rooted deeply in our notions of that there is more to this than just the material world. Mm-hmm. But scientism, this belief, this ardent belief in science and the scientific materialism is really this kind of, it either ends in sort of absurdity or unsustainability in as much as the person can't really live the scientific material life without sort of inventing ethics and inventing morals and that, mm-hmm. or they really do follow that down the rabbit hole and you end up with Pol Pot, the killing fields.
Mm-hmm. Right. You have to go somewhere with it. You can't just kind of sit with it as it is.
Yeah. So as we kind of look at the Catholic Church and this notion of science, we come back to, I think, the fact that the Catholic Church, Christianity in general, is very comfortable with science. And here's the thought I want to kind of explore here before as we kind of draw to the end of the episode and get your thoughts to this. I would actually say that Christianity in general, Catholicism in particular, that it only makes 3 claims that have anything to do with science, or 3 points at which somebody who believes in science with a capital S might find it disagreeable. Okay. The first point is that there is something beyond the material world. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean,
just a fundamental point.
The fundamental point, right? So a person who is a scientific materialist would say, I reject Catholicism because it asserts a God. And I go, okay, fine. That's a point of contention. The weird thing about it is that the scientific method can't tell you anything about it, because all it can do is observe the material world. So if I claim there's something beyond the material world, there's nothing that you can see, feel, measure, touch, feel, smell, put in a lab notebook, look at through a telescope, look at through a microscope that can tell you whether there's something beyond the things that you see, feel, touch, and observe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's weirdly a sort of funhouse mirror image of, some kind of wacky mysticism where you start denying the reality of the physical world around you, whether this is, Christian Science or
right.
some forms of Buddhism, because only the philosophical or the religious is a way of obtaining knowledge, and therefore you end up denying the validity of the physical world and
right.
of the sciences. But it's the opposite. You say philosophy and religion are bunk because they do not obtain truth through the same method as I do when I do physical observations of the world.
Right. So my first point where I would say someone could argue that Catholicism and science, the scientific worldview, are at odds, are simply the worldview. Mm-hmm. But that isn't resolved. That doesn't make Catholicism anti-science. It just makes it anti-materialist. And the materialist can't, really, we just have to have that argument. The only way to resolve that argument is through philosophy.
Right. And as we discussed with just the historical record, the fact that you believe in the supernatural has not, stunted or stopped your investigation of the natural. Right. It's not as if you stop believing in science because you believe in God and angels.
Okay. The second point at which I think one could argue that Christianity or Catholicism is opposed to science, the capital S, or scientism, is the notion of origins, what we talked about in the last episode about the origins of the world and evolution. And that is a point where I will grant that Catholicism or Christianity makes assertions. And as we saw in the last episode, we can have a lot of disagreements about how that all plays out. But it's going to make, there is going to be a difference of opinion about the origins of the world and the origins of mankind. Mm-hmm. Okay? Granted, that is a point of contention. But then we get to the only other thing that I can think of in terms of being opposed to science is Christianity or Catholicism asserts particular miracles. Okay? Now, a few minutes ago, when we were talking about how God is consistent and not capricious, and he makes the world in certain ways, and white pine trees always have 5 needles and red pine trees always have 2 needles, and then God makes it that way, and you can count on that because he's consistent, except if he makes a miraculous tree. Right? But here's the point, is that Catholicism asserts particular miracles, right? I mean, God doesn't go around making like weird, needle fluid trees. Mm-hmm. What it is rare occasions, that's why they're called miracles, at very rare occasions, a supernatural God who is a creator chooses, using his power, to do particular miracles. So, raising Jesus from the dead, raising Lazarus from the dead, right?
Healings,
parting the Red Sea,
water into wine.
On every altar, at every mass, right? The transubstantiation of the elements. But the assertion there is that those are particular miracles. And the Catholic is not saying, hey, the world is this kind of mishmash, gooey thing that is not knowable through science. It is knowable through science. It's just from time to time, the creator of the material world chooses to intervene. And on that seems to me that the science with a capital S people, you have to go back to the top and argue about whether there's a God or not.
Right.
The science with a small s, though, the scientific method, can investigate particular miracles. So here's a perfect example. The Shroud of Turin, right? So, right, you know what the Shroud of Turin is? It's in Torino, Italy, right? That's not where it came from, right? But that's where it's traditionally been. And it is claimed to be the burial shroud of Christ in which he was resurrected, right? Buried and then resurrected. And it has all these extraordinary properties and blah, blah, blah. And so over the years, it has been subjected to various, examinations, carbon-14 dating and radio
sampling of the materials.
Electron microscope, something or other, right? Right. Now that is applying the science, and guess who did that?
The Vatican.
Right? I mean, the Catholic Church led and not only facilitated but led those scientific method evaluations. Because if the electron scanning microscope and the radiocarbon dating and this and that shows that it's fake, then it's fake, right? And again, I'm not going to do an episode about the Shroud of Turin here, but the point is that the small s scientific method can investigate a particular miracle like the Shroud of Turin and try to determine whether that miracle is valid or not, which is what is done a lot of times when there are miraculous claims brought to the Vatican, say in the canonization process for a saint, in which scientists are brought in to examine the claimed miracles. And in almost the vast majority of the cases, the scientific method rules them out and says the miracle wasn't a miracle. It's only a very small number that are validated. So the Catholic is not claiming that the scientific method is suspended, but that it is claiming that God on rare occasions chooses to make an exception or intervene in the material universe. And that exception, the principle that God can do that from time to time is a philosophical principle, but any particular instance of it is subject to scientific method examination.
Right. And the irony there is that the person who believes in miracles, or at least believes that miracles could be possible, is open to the workings of the scientific method there. We can do an investigation. We can make all of the physical observations and figure out whether it's true or not. Whereas the person who's committed to materialism has shut down the scientific process. They're not willing to look. They a priori have drawn the conclusion that it can't possibly be a miracle. And so there's no science to do here, nothing to see here, go home.
Now, it just occurs to me as we say this, that now we're going to need to do another episode about a particular type of miracle, and that is transubstantiation of the Eucharist, because that is a kind of a unique miracle, and a lot of people object to it, including like Protestants, right, who don't believe in it, and that really does go back at the history of that miracle, or at least the scientific understanding of it, or the claims about it, really do go back to these notes of Aristotle, medieval universities, the difference of what happened in the Enlightenment, and we're going to have to come back to that, because it's a very particular kind of miracle that is not subject under normal instances to the scientific method.
It's a unique miracle in many ways.
It's a very unique miracle because the claim that the elements are essentially or substantively transformed, but not accidentally, is not subject to scientific examination. But of course, the claim there is not that they are literally, they are accidentally, right? So, however, when there are Eucharistic miracles where it's claimed that the substance is made manifest accidentally, in some of those instances, and the Vatican has subjected them.
Yeah, and I believe we did a whole episode about Eucharistic miracles, or at least that was part of our discussion in previous episodes. So if anyone's interested in that, they can find
I think we may want to come back to that and talk about in the light of the sort of scientific method, how this sort of investigate. So anyway, this has been a little bit of a meandering thing here, but I hope that the listeners got something out of this in the sense of that the Catholic Church is not opposed to the scientific method or the empirical sciences by any means. In fact, it's been a champion of them, but that the elevation of science to a sort of a scientific materialist worldview is fundamentally opposed to Catholicism, but on philosophical grounds.
Yeah, not ones that are based on the actual scientific observations.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Cory.
Yep, thanks.
All right, bye. Thank you for listening. My name is Greg Smith. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with others. And if you're curious about the Catholic worldview and faith, the Church and its saints, or Catholic history, culture, and art, then visit consideringcatholicism.com. And email me to let me know what you think. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com.